And these are going to feed our capillary beds. So now let's walk through capillaries. Capillaries are microscopic blood vessels. You have to have a microscope to see these. And these are very different. We talked about our 3 layers, tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa, right? We find that in arteries and veins. We do not find all 3 of those in our capillaries. In capillaries, there is a tunica intima. That's it. How come? Why wouldn't you have all 3 layers in a capillary? Why just 1 layer?
They're so small.
Yeah, they're microscopic, but think of the function of a capillary bed. What's it doing? It's feeding your tissues, right? It's getting nutrients and oxygen from your blood into your cells, right? It'd be pretty hard to do that if if oxygen had to move through a tunica intima, a tunica media, and a tunica externa to get to the tissue. So there's just 1 thin little layer in there, tunica intima, that's it. The thinner it is, the better it is at gas exchange and nutrient exchange. So capillary beds have a very thin wall. Now there are some cells called pericytes. These are basically smooth muscle cells. They help to stabilize the walls of capillaries. Since the capillary walls are so thin, they have to be stabilized some way. So that's pericytes. And I showed you a video in chapter 17 of red blood cells passing through a capillary. Do y'all remember that? And do you remember how in the capillary you could see single file red blood cells passing through? That's how small the diameter of capillaries are. They are just big enough for 1 red blood cell to fit through at a time. So they are very small. You're going to find capillaries in any tissue that is vascular. So any tissue that has a blood supply will have capillaries in it, okay? So like bone, muscle, nervous tissue, you're going to find capillaries in all those tissues. Where would you not find capillaries would be in any tissue that is avascular. So epithelial tissue, like the top layer of your skin, this has no capillaries in it. It gets nutrients from diffusion from the dermis. Okay, so remember, you get a paper cut, hurts like hell, right? But it doesn't bleed because you have no capillaries in the epidermis. Okay, it's avascular. Cartilage, this is why it takes cartilage so long to heal. Cartilage does not have a blood supply. It is avascular. You tear the meniscus of your knee, it usually requires surgery. If not, it's going to take weeks to heal and feel better. Other places would be like your cornea. The cornea on the outer part of your eye, that clear lens on the outer part, that does not have a blood supply. This actually is the #1 organ transplant because there is no blood supply, which means there's no chance of rejection. Your white blood cells aren't going to try to fight it off, right? You don't have antibodies that are going to fight it off. And even the lens of the eye, which is looks like a little pebble that helps to direct light to the retina, that also does not have a blood supply. So you find capillaries pretty much everywhere except these areas that I just mentioned. And the job of a capillary is to just feed the tissues and those cells with nutrients. The functions are gas exchange, put oxygen into the cells and take out CO2, which is a waste. Provide nutrients, but pull out metabolic wastes. Provide hormones to those cells and move hormones around the body. So there are, just like with arteries, there are different kinds of capillaries. So there's 3 different types of capillaries. And which type we have depends on where we are in the body. So the first one we'll walk through are called continuous capillaries. These are just like what they sound like they are. These are capillaries that are continuous. They have no breaks, they have no openings. Fenestrated capillaries, the term fenestration means pore or hole. You got little holes in them. So they're going to be more permeable. And then sinusoid capillaries have sinusoids, which are big clefts, big gaps. So let's go through each of these. We're going to start with continuous capillaries. These are abundant in like the dermis of the skin. Oops. So not the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis does not have a blood supply, but the dermis does, and muscles. Okay, so the dermis and the muscles will have continuous capillaries. These are capillaries that have a lot of tight junctions within the wall of the capillary. They have some little clefts. We call them intercellular clefts or gaps. These are going to allow fluid and very small solutes to pass from the capillary into the tissue. Okay, now you are not going to find these intercellular clefts in the brain. Remember, the brain has something called the blood-brain barrier. It has a continuous endothelial lining. And so this is going to keep out, for example, hormones from the brain, because you don't want a lot of hormones, amino acids, a lot of those act like neurotransmitters. You don't want those being able to get all out into your nervous tissue because your brain would not be able to function. Now, we do have some little areas in the brain, places like the hypothalamus, where there is no blood-brain barrier, places like the medulla oblongata, where there isn't a blood-brain barrier. And this is so that your brain can identify chemicals and hormone shifts. But otherwise, everywhere else in your brain, it is continuous. There are no intercellular clefts in the majority of the brain. Okay. Now, the other kind of capillary are called fenestrated capillaries. The term fenestration means pore. So if you look at this image down here, you can actually see all these little holes in the capillary wall. So these are going to be more permeable than a continuous capillary. And their job is going to be to help with absorption, filtration, and secretion. So we're going to find these in places like the intestines, small intestines, where we're absorbing nutrients. We're going to find these in our endocrine glands, where we are releasing hormones into our bloodstream so they can absorb those hormones. We're going to find them in our kidneys, because the kidneys are filtering your bloodstream and getting rid of waste. So anywhere where we are absorbing, we are filtering, that's where we're going to find fenestrated capillaries. And then the most permeable of the three capillaries, we just went from least permeable to most permeable. Most permeable are sinusoid capillaries. And if you look at this image down here, you can see these big clefts, these big openings. This does not have a lot of tight junctions in it. It has these big fenestrations, these big intercellular clefts, and a large lumen. These are going to be anywhere where you need to be able to pass big things like cells back and forth. Okay, so one example of where we would find sinusoid capillaries is here, bone marrow. Why do you need sinusoid capillaries in your bone marrow? What's happening in bone marrow?
Blood cell formation.
You are making blood cells. And once they are made, you have to put them into the vessels, right? So this is why you're going to have sinusoid capillaries in your bone marrow, okay? You're going to have them in the spleen. What does your spleen do?
Graveyard.
It does what? Yes. Red blood cell graveyard. So we're taking red blood cells out of circulation in the spleen, which means we've got to pull them out of the capillaries. So we're going to have these big sinusoid capillaries in areas where we need to pass cells back and forth. Okay. Now that we know our kinds of capillaries, again, I listed them in order. We went through them in order of least permeable, okay, continuous capillaries, to most permeable, those sinusoid capillaries. Let's talk a little bit about a capillary bed. A capillary bed provides something called microcirculation. This is basically flow from the arterial end, remember the term arteriole, eole means very small, to the veinule end. Again, eole means small. Now there are little sphincter muscles. Now you should know what the term sphincter means, right? A sphincter muscle is a round muscle. We have them all over our body. Your lips, your eyes, those are sphincter muscles. When they contract, they close. You have them in the anus as well. You also have them in capillary beds. So you have some at the start of a capillary bed that have the ability to close. They can actually shunt the blood around the capillary bed so you don't feed that tissue, okay? And it's chemical changes and nerves that will regulate those sphincter muscles. So what does that mean? That's the difference between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. So remember, when I think of sympathetic, I think sympathetic. That is that fight or flight response. That means that you are going to pump blood out to your muscles. So pre-capillary sphincters feeding the capillary beds going into muscles, they're going to dilate and get big. We're going to feed our muscles because we may have to flee. But all those sphincters that are going into, for example, the GI tract, you don't need to worry about digesting your food when you've got to run away. Those are going to close. Okay, so this is why we say that it's local chemical conditions and vasomotor nerves that are going to regulate those pre-capillary sphincters. So here's a good picture from your book. If we look at the top, this is showing us a capillary bed. We come in through the arteriole, moves through the capillary bed, okay, and it's leaving through a venule. Okay, remember, yole at the end just means tiny. And in this case, you can see that the pre-capillary sphincters are all open. So you can see all these sphincter muscles, you can see them in here, they're all open, so we're perfusing the blood through that capillary bed. If you look at the image on the bottom, you can see that the blood's coming in through the arteriole, it's basically running all the way through and coming out through the venule. But notice all these sphincter muscles here are closed, so we're really not perfusing the capillary bed. Okay?